Let me touch on one more phytoestrogen,
Okay. All right.
and it's not necessarily one that's really affecting the health food community, but I think it's really worth noting, is that hops are probably the number one most consumed phytoestrogen. And, it turns out that basically, beer never had hops in it before. And for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and literally thousands of years, people made beers out of many different plants, all of them medicinal, and they never included hops. And it wasn't until 1516 that there was a law enacted, really pushed through by the Protestants of the time, requiring beers to contain hops, called the Beer Purity Act in Germany. And what they found was that when women picked hops, that they would have early menstrual cycles. And they also found that it was feminizing to men, that it reduced libido, that it made people sleepy, and that they had less kind of rowdiness because the beers of the time were a bit more stimulating. And so they found it was slightly sedating to the population and required all beers contain hops. And since then, all beers do contain hops. Here's an interesting thing to note about phytoestrogens. The phytoestrogens in soy lead to a different type of feminization than the type of phytoestrogens that are in hops. So whereas hops tends to create a big belly in a man and sort of breast tissue, we see that soy takes a man in the opposite direction, tends to make them real thin, and they lose different types of secondary sex characteristics.
But they're both phytoestrogens.
But they're both phytoestrogens, but they appear to work in really different directions.
What is the connection with the Beer Purity Act, 1500, and hops and Protestants? I'm kind of thinking I know where you're going, but spell it out.
Basically, that was the first drug law. That was the first drug law, and it was an early attempt to start sedating the population in Europe. Now, the beers that people drank then were very healthy, so a lot of us have really attached, alcohol, the idea of alcohol being a poison, whereas throughout history, alcohol was a really beneficial medicine because it was used as a solvent to carry medicine throughout people's bodies. And people, went to an ale house to cure their ales, and people would ferment high-quality herbs. Now, what happened was the Protestants really stepped in and tried to create a drug law. And so, today that's very common. We're used to many different types of prohibition today where what we can consume is being restricted. But this was an early attempt, basically, much like fluoride is being used today, where we know it's a sedative, and yet it's in our food supply.
Yeah.
Similarly, hops was brought in to basically sedate the European population.
That's fascinating. That is really... So the beers today with the hops, it's just not good for the guys, which is, I guess, why they go to sleep after they have a lot of beers instead of making out with their girlfriend.
So media shows us these pictures of men drinking beer. We see this in the commercials.
Right.
It looks like it creates an increase in libido.
Of course, they have these ripped stomach. Yeah, they have the ripped stomach.
Exactly.
Marketing.
But what we actually find out is it creates a lot of breast tissue. It causes a loss of erection over time, and men tend to get sleepy and pass out when they drink beer. So it's too much estrogen for a male body, and it's very difficult today to find a beer without hops, actually.
So here's the deal. You take this link to this website, and you send it to all the people you know who drink beer, especially you gals, to your boyfriends, and maybe... Can you get beer without hops?
It's really difficult to find them that way, to be honest, and... of course, you can brew your own beer at home, and you can do that with herbs the way it was traditionally done. For instance, in Canada, you can still find dandelion beers, which are, of course, very healing for the liver and kidneys. And they're a fermented food, so they're much like sauerkraut or kimchi or kefir or something like that. So they were actually very healthy beverages, a bit like a kombucha, whereas today they're so full of estrogen that we associate what we see in men with the alcohol, but it's actually from the hops.
Very interesting. So, beers before this Beer Purity Act, and isn't it interesting? I just find it fascinating. It's really the doublespeak that was going on back then. Have you ever heard of Social Security? I mean, there's nothing secure about it at all. There is no money in there. And they do this all the time. Or with the Bank Secrecy Act and, the Patriot Act, which some would argue is the most unpatriotic thing that one could do. And the Beer Purity Act, and they actually diluted the quality of the beer.
Yeah, they actually added a poison in and then called it the Purity Act.
Yeah, God love them, man. 400 years ago, they were all over.
Classic.
It's classic, man. That's fascinating. So the beers back then, Daniel, they were used for actually healing properties.
Yeah, and we see that ubiquitously through all cultures all over the planet, that everybody had a fermentation technology. And everybody would... Now, when you ferment at home in this way, it limits the amount of alcohol that can be produced. It never is going to go much higher than 15%. So that's just like what we see with wine. And we see that cultures that responsibly drink wine have longer lifespans, almost always.
Yeah.
So beer was the same way. It was used in a really intelligent way, and it always contained medicine. And today, it's mostly a solvent made with really poorly grown crops.
It's just
poorly grown grains.
Even the European ones, like the real heavy kind of, real expensive kind of European lagers, or they must be a little better. You would think they would be.
I would think that the ingredients are higher quality, but they're still full of hops, and they're I don't see the kind of quality in them that would make me want to drink them.
So the main things then with everyday consumers of food and beer, or would be commercial beer, soy and flax. Those are one of the big threes to make the estrogen go up and the testosterone go down.
Yeah, those are the three big ones. And here's the thing about it. Now, there's estrogens in all kinds of foods, and that's okay. Women are meant to have estrogen levels. Men are meant to have estrogen levels, and it's okay to consume foods with estrogen. The problem is when you bring in a food to be a staple food, you're going to eat that as one of your main food sources day in and day out, and it's extremely estrogenic. That's where you run into problems. So, beer for some people is a daily food.
Of course.
Flax can be a daily food for people. Soy is a daily food for many people. And over time, day after day after day, they undermine their endocrine system. Whereas if you had flax, a couple times here and there, that's fine. That your body can tolerate that, but it can't tolerate a barrage of it day in and day out. And what we need to understand about food is that every people on the planet has chosen a staple food when they make a sustainable culture. And that food needs to be chosen very intelligently. And we look at Asians, for instance, they chose rice, which is a hypoallergenic food, whereas in the West, we chose foods that were actually allergenic, and it's undermined us. So we have a food like wheat, which is glutinous and allergenic, and it's undermined the health of our culture.
Yes.
Because we didn't wisely choose the staple food. Now, the raw food people, the superfood people, the extreme end of the health food people, we need to be intelligent as we move forward choosing a staple food, because we're sort of poking around in the dark, experimenting with foods that have never been used in that way or for that capacity. So I think that we need to apply some logic and some common sense, and we need to be in our bodies and feel the effects of these foods, and we need not to rely on marketing information.
Yes, good advice.